to start us off, I'd like to point out that all of modern finance, both in delegated asset management and in corporate finance, is based on the principle of separation of ownership and control, where selecting managers is one of the most important tasks for the shareholders. So we hope that this paper provides some insights to the question of how do we pick high-type managers. And in this paper, we're going to argue that in settings with high entry barriers, such as management professions or fund management, family descent can serve as a valuable signal of managerial quality. Here's the argument that we will advance in the paper. The main idea is that if a manager is born rich, they can become, or if an individual is born rich, they can become a manager through their wealth, inherited status, professional networks, without necessarily being a high type or being highly skilled. Think of an extreme example of a son of a CEO who becomes the next CEO of a family-owned business simply because he's inherited with a family status. On the other hand, if a manager is born poor, they need to really go through multiple selection thresholds in order to get to that high stage of entering a highly selective managerial field. So they face higher entry barriers, so only the ones that are able to exceed these multiple high entry barriers are able to enter into the profession. And therefore, managers that come from poor backgrounds, that would be the central prediction of this paper, would be on average of higher type, simply because they've gone through these this more rigorous selection process and have exceeded these continuous thresholds. So think of, let's say, an individual who's born in a poor neighborhood in the state of Mississippi. It's very difficult to get access to, let's say, high-quality high school education. It's more difficult for them to get into college. It's more difficult for them to get a high-quality job conditional on attending college. So if they're able to exceed all these thresholds, they're more likely to be of higher type. That's the story. So how do we exactly test this hypothesis? This is the first paper in finance that will provide individual data on census records that will trace the wealth, income, and profession of managers' parents. So we're going to be looking at the wealth that the managers endowed at their birth, and we'll be going to their individual census record where the manager is just a little kid. So those will be the main variables that will determine wealth and sort of professional networks and so on that the manager is endowed with, and then we'll relate this to outcomes of managerial performance in the mutual fund industry. We believe this is a very convenient empirical setting in which to test this hypothesis. First, there are clearly high entry barriers into this profession. It's a highly selective profession. Second, there's a one-to-one correspondence between the manager's decisions and mutual fund outcomes, hence the focus on solo managed mutual funds. We also know how to measure mutual fund performance, and there's a fairly clean investment opportunity set faced by managers managing similar types of funds. This is the empirical setting. So what do we find? I'll point out three types of findings. The one first on performance, then on the career path, and then on some of the mechanisms. First, on our main finding is that managers that are born poor significantly outperform managers that are born rich. The performance differential between the extreme quintiles is approximately 2% per year on a risk-adjusted basis when measured by 4-factor alphas. This performance differential is very similar if we look at net or gross alphas, if we look at benchmark-adjusted returns or abnormal returns over benchmark, or if we use the Berkman-Bisbergen measure of value extracted from capital markets. So what is the driver of that performance differential? Is it the outperformance of the poor or the underperformance of the rich? Our findings are most consistent with the underperformance of the richest managers that are born to ultra-wealthy families. All right, then we try to think about what other reasons might there be for those managers to stay in the profession if they underperform. We check whether they help attract greater fund flows for the fund family, and we don't find explicit evidence of that. However, of course, there might be other agency motives that the fund family or the benefits the fund family might reap. Think of IPOs or maybe access to some good lawyers and so on that may provide the benefits to the fund company that these managers are retained, even though, again, these benefits do not ultimately accrue to the investors who have to bear lower performance consequences. we look at the career paths and we find evidence consistent with the selection hypothesis that I outlined. So first of all else equal, managers who are born rich are significantly more likely to be promoted. Okay. Second, managers that are born poor, they are promoted only if they outperform. So in other words, their promotion decisions are significantly more performance sensitive, whereas the ones that are born rich are maybe promoted for other reasons without necessarily being skilled. This is consistent with the idea that among the poor, only the high types advance. And finally, we look at some of the mechanisms of where this value creation may stem from. We find some evidence that managers that are born poor are more active. So to some extent, they work harder. There's greater turnover. There's somewhat greater active share and deviation from the indices. But the main channel seems to be that their trades are more value added compared to the rich. So overall, the sort of the punchline of the paper is that in settings with high entry barriers, family descent can serve as a valuable signal of managerial quality, and we believe this is the first paper that links managerial family descent and their ability to add value for fund managers. So how exactly do we establish these findings? We start off with the Morningstar database of mutual fund managers, which includes life funds, deceased fund, the funds that were liquidated. So if a fund was in existence, it is in that database. So then we use sort of the standard data sources. The only non-standard data source is that we try to be very careful when we account for education, because it's an important factor that is correlated with wealth. And we actually email universities to get very precise data on fund managers' education, date of graduation, major, and so on. They're obligated to disclose this information if we want to confirm fund manager's degree. So this is the main value added from the paper is really the information on the family background. So our primary database is the LexisNexis Public Records database. This is the most comprehensive public records database that is used typically for legal purposes. Individuals are traced through their social security numbers throughout the database. The database covers approximately 500 million of US population, both live and deceased. And what do you need to be included in that database? You only need to have a social security number. You can be a foreign citizen, you can be a recent immigrant, you can move in and out, you don't need to own a house, all you need is a social security number, and this is how people are traced. And then we supplement this with birth, marriage, and death records to identify the manager's household. So when we match a manager to the national census, we want to be very precise that the manager that we identify is indeed the fund manager that we're interested in. So we first establish their parents and siblings, and then we go into the census, we identify not just that manager, but the household with the parents and siblings, so that we can be reliably confident that we have identified the correct data. So let me just illustrate sort of how exactly we identify the manager's family tree and parents and siblings. So first we start with state birth records. So here that are maintained by the Department of Health of each state. So if you have the manager's full name and date of birth, you can pull up their birth record. So here's an example of Ohio. You have a manager, Jeffrey Atkinson Broad. You get his mother's maiden name, his mother's birthplace, father's name, and so on. So much for using mother's maiden name as your password for online services. Same for Texas. You have a manager, you got their parents, and so on. So then we know what household to look at. So another example, sort of, if we run short of finding a manager that way, we can pull up the assessment record or the tax record for the house that the manager owns. In almost all the cases, the house is co-owned with the wife, right? So we can identify the wife of the manager from the ownership of the house, if they've owned any house in their life, or they were married at some point in their life. And then once we identify the spouse, we pull up their marriage certificate, and the marriage certificate gives us their parents. And again, we've locked in the manager's household. We can go to the 1940 census and pull up their birth record. Lastly, death records and obituaries. So here's an example of how we deal with managers that have common names. So here's a relatively common name, Kirk. So David G. Kirk is a fund manager in our sample. He's married to Ann B. Kirk, and they live in Sudbury, Massachusetts, which is just half an hour west of here. So once we know the name of the wife, we search the obituaries with even local, very obscure newspapers that list the manager and the wife as the survivors. So here's an example of an obituary. So this is an obituary for a manager's brother. He's survived by his brothers and sisters, David G. Kirk and his wife Anne of Sudbury, Massachusetts. Now that we know the name of the wife and it matches the place where they live, we know we've locked in the right record, so we can get, again, the names of the parents and the names of the siblings and identify the correct record. So that is the process. Now, what are the outcomes? So let me first show you what our data looks like and what the typical census record looks like. So I'm not going to ask you to read it. So our records come in the form of images, of photo images of actual handwritten census records. So I'm going to highlight a census record of one of the fund managers in the sample, and I'll zoom in on that record and show you what is in that record. But for now, I'd like to just point out that one of the first findings is that managers come from very highly segregated neighborhoods. Many of them come from ultra-rich neighborhoods and surrounded by very wide shoe professions. So here's an example of professions. Counselor for investments, treasurer of Paramount Pictures, stockbroker, president, electric appliances company. So they come from very special neighborhoods, and in general, money managers come from money. So here's a snapshot of the census record where we zoom in on a particular fund manager. So the fund manager that we're interested in here is Reginald Foster, who's just a little kid at the time of the census, and we focus on his father, Reginald Foster Sr. He's a stockbroker. He makes over $5,000 a year, which is in the 99th percentile in 1940 when the manager is a kid. He's got 2 servants, and we get the data on their servants' income, education, history, and it turns out that having grown up with servants tends to be a strong negative predictor of your performance when you grow up. So here's another way to describe the data. Here's the distribution of incomes of managers' parents relative to the incomes of the general population at large. The blue bars represent the general U.S. population, and the red bars represent the families of fund managers. So the first thing I'd like to point out is that managers come from rich families. The average income of managers' parents is at the 89th percentile, roughly the top 10% of the U.S. population. And secondly, there's a huge amount of dispersion, right? So when I show you quintile regressions, the managers that are in the bottom quintile relative to other fund managers are also sort of at the bottom of the population at large. And the managers that are rich are certainly the ultra-rich relative to the population. So high mean and a very wide dispersion where they come from, which gives us a lot of identification power. They also come from more educated families with about 3 more years of college degrees. So the main finding in the paper is that those that come from ultra-rich families in the absolute right tail in wealth tend to be weaker performers. So now let's provide a little bit more formal evidence in regression design that also accounts for many other correlates, such as parents' education, such as parents, so managers' own education and other correlates of wealth. So first I'm going to start off with just linear regressions where we use different measures of wealth. We can use their income, we can use the rent value of the house, we can use the wealth index with the wealth rank, which is just the value of the house in which they live. They're negatively related to managerial performance, and we control for other manager characteristics such as age, quality of their education, for parents' characteristics, their management job, number of years of education, and lots of fun characteristics as well. So in quintiles, you get a sense of the economic magnitudes. I think it's a nice way to summarize the economic magnitudes. If you only include fund manager controls, the performance differential between the top and bottom quintile of managers' wealth is approximately 150 basis points a year. All right? As you start adding additional controls, the magnitudes typically increase and statistical significance increases as well. So why is that? Well, the reason is it does help to go to Harvard. It does help to have managers, parents who are in the finance industry who are well connected, because we know from prior literature that social connections help increase performance. We know from prior literature that SAT scores or education quality are helpful. So if you keep adding controls, you could raise that performance differential to about 2 percentage points per year. But really, picking the rich and the poor, I think that this is a more realistic estimate of 1.5 or 1.6% per year. And the main driver, if you look at the performance across different quintiles, is really the underperformance of the ultra-rich, of the richest. This result is not specific to how we measure performance. So here I've put on in the table 4 other ways that you could measure performance in the mutual fund literature, using both net and gross alphas, using benchmark adjusted returns, abnormal returns over benchmark, or the value extracted from capital markets. The results are pretty robust to different ways you could measure performance. You want to put the results in dollar terms as opposed to just the value, as opposed to percentage terms. One way to summarize them would be that an interquartile range, if an increase in managers' wealth, corresponds to a monthly loss of approximately $3 million expressed in 2012 dollars, as measured by the Van Bisbergen and Burke measure of value extracted from capital markets. So far, I have given you the results about the means of managerial performance. Our selection hypothesis also has important predictions for the variance in performance. If it is really true that managers that come from poor backgrounds face significantly higher thresholds for entry into their profession, their performance is going to be significantly less dispersed, so that only the high types are able to enter, and that variance in their performance in the cross section is going to be significantly tighter. If, on the other hand, you're born rich, you can enter the profession if you're really, really good, if you're okay, or if you're just mediocre through other channels. And our prediction of the selection hypothesis, again, is that the dispersion in managerial performance is going to be greater because different types can enter. So a formal way to test this is the Goldfield quant test for directional heteroscedasticity, and we find evidence consistent with those predictions that I just outlined. So first, we find that alpha dispersion is significantly higher among managers that come from richer families, consistent with the fact that managers may enter into the profession having a lower bar, and some of the ones that enter could be good and bad and mediocre. And as you start splitting the sample into between the rich and poor into more and more selective categories, instead of just looking at the below the mean and above the mean, if you look, let's say, at the top quartile and the bottom quartile, that difference becomes even starker and even more economically significant. So the ratio of residual variances is even higher if the comparison groups focus on the tails and the distribution. So the further you go on the tails, the greater this difference in dispersion, again consistent with the selection hypothesis. And we provide evidence also from their career trajectories. We study the career of these cohorts of managers and see how they get promoted and what happens to them conditional on performance. So our main finding here is that promotions of managers from poor families are significantly more performance sensitive, whereas managers that come from richer families, first of all, may get promoted without necessarily being skilled, and second, may be promoted for other reasons that are not directly linked to performance. And lastly, we look at the ability of managers to attract mutual fund flows. Because ultimately, the mutual fund industry is structured in such a way that fees are based on assets under management. So ultimately, mutual fund companies might be more interested in not necessarily the returns, but just the assets under management. So the hypothesis we test here is whether or not there's any difference in the ability of the managers to attract flows, and we do not find any effect. So we find that we've looked pretty hard to identify the effects with different variations of controls and fixed effects, find no evidence that managers that are born rich are better at attracting flows in a particular setting of the mutual fund industry. This may be quite different in the private wealth management industry, let's say, or in private equity, where there's a tighter contact between the manager and the client, and when instead in the mutual fund industry, the survey evidence tells us the vast majority of investors do not even know the name of their fund manager in the database. So we find that the flows are driven primarily by fund and fund family characteristics, and that fund manager characteristics have very little effect on flows. Okay? So these are the main findings in the paper, and I'd like to conclude by providing you sort of an industry perspective of anecdotal evidence that some of the managers appear to be aware of these different entry barriers into the profession for the rich and the poor. So here's a quote from a Wall Street Journal reporter that speaks to this effect. Since the days when the Goldmans and Morgans cared mostly about hiring young men from the best families and schools, the Bear, or Bear Stearns, cared about one thing only, and that is making money. Its longtime chairman, Ace Greenberg, even coined a name for his motley hires: PSDs, for poor, smart, and a deep desire to get rich. And the same quote from the chairman himself: I think it is important that we continue a policy that has helped us prosper. We're really looking for people with PhD degrees, again, for poor, smart, and a deep desire to get rich. So let me stop here and conclude. In this paper, we argue that in settings with high entry barriers, family descent can be a valuable signal of managerial quality, and we provide evidence that this is consistent with a selection mechanism where the inherited status changes the stringency of selection, changes the entry barriers into the profession. So if I were to zoom out and put this paper in the perspective of the broader literature, it's the first evidence on the family backgrounds on investment professionals, and one of the first links between family status and a manager's ability to create value. Thank you for your time.